Alrighty, guys, today we're going to talk about the Underground Railroad. This is something that most of you have probably heard of before. And one thing that I do want to go ahead and get out of the way is that when a lot of people picture the Underground Railroad, they usually picture something that looks a little bit like this, like an underground subway train tunnel or something like that. But the Underground Railroad was none of those things. The Underground Railroad was a code name that was given to the series of people and safe houses that helped people escape from the South up to freedom, either in the north part of the United States or eventually into Canada. There were dozens, if not hundreds, of different pathways that these runaway slaves could take. The name comes from the fact that when slave owners and slave catchers were trying to recapture runaway slaves, it was really hard to do so because it seemed almost as if they disappeared underground while they were being chased. And then the reason why it's called a railroad is because at the time, railroad was the fastest way to get around anywhere. So that's where the name comes from. Most people, when they're traveling on the Underground Railroad, are usually going up north into Canada, or sometimes out into Mexico or Florida or some of the Caribbean islands, or just other places that Britain owned where slavery was outlawed and illegal, and slave owners would not be able to go in there and go after them. Runaways would usually travel at night and then hide during the day in safe houses that abolitionists gave the code name stations. If you were the keeper of a safe house, you were called a station master because everything's railroad themed on the Underground Railroad. There were a lot of different signs that people would put on their homes as like a signal, like, yeah, this is a station that you can come to and you'll be safe. Because again, most of the time they're running away at night. It's very dark. You're kind of terrified. You're looking for any kind of sign, like to make sure that you're actually at the right house. Because if you knock on the door of the wrong house, you're very likely going to be recaptured and sent back into slavery while you be severely punished for trying to run away. So a few signs that station masters would put on their homes to mark that this is a safe house or a station. Sometimes they would take some white bricks and put them on top of the chimney. Others would take a lantern and light it and hang it outside the house. And those tended to be the two more popular ways. Since this is technically illegal, what people were doing, there were a lot of different code names that people gave things on the Underground Railroad in order to keep their actions secret and the people who were involved safe. So the name Freedom Train was a code name for the Underground Railroad. Saying things like heaven or the promised land or sometimes Canaan was another way of saying Canada. An agent was somebody who was plotting the course of the escape and making contacts. A conductor or a shepherd would be somebody who is physically on the Underground Railroad with the runaway slaves and getting them from one safe house to another. And then a stockholder was somebody who would donate money, clothes, food, and other supplies like that to the railroad. So I have some codes that I'll put up here, and you can pause it for a second and see if you can figure out what they think they were. And then in about 3 seconds, I'll go over what each of them are. So if you want a chance to do it on your own, go ahead and pause here. All right, so let's start with the first one and see how you did. So the first code says, the wind blows from the south today. This would be a way of telling another station master or conductor that there are slave bounty hunters nearby, so just keep an eye out. If somebody came up to you and said, hey, I'm a friend of a friend, that was a password used to signal that there were fugitives with a conductor that were here and that they're on the same side. If somebody told you that they would be dropping off something like a package or a parcel or a bundle or anything similar to that, that meant that you need to be ready because there are going to be some fugitives that are going to be dropped off with you either later tonight or tomorrow. A conductor named William Still once got this telegram in Philadelphia. I have sent via at 2 o'clock 4 large and 2 small hams. Now, William Still was a conductor on the Underground Railroad, so this was heavily encoded, because if this got intercepted and it just said, like, hey, this person's working for the Underground Railroad and they're helping slaves escape, that guy's definitely going to get arrested and those slaves are going to be recaptured. So what this basically said was that it was letting Still know that there were going to be 4 fugitives, 2 adults and 2 kids, The word via meant that they would not be coming on the regular route because the slave catchers had kind of figured out where that route was, and so they were going to be headed a different way, and William still had to go to the new station and help them escape so that they didn't go to the wrong station and get captured because that one had been compromised. People who were helping slaves escape could be severely punished and had to be very careful. There was a guy named Jonathan Walker. He was a sailor, and he had built this secret room inside of his boat where he was hiding slaves and was ferrying them across the river. When he was caught, he was sent to jail, and then they took a brand and burned the letters SS into the palm of his right hand, which stood for slave stealer, for carrying slaves on his ship. And what the SS was supposed to stand for is slave stealer. And so anytime he shook hands with somebody, they would see that, and people from the South would more than likely not do business with him anymore. But people found all kinds of creative ways besides just hiding them in a secret room on their ship, to kind of conceal runaway slaves during the day, because again, they're only safe to travel at night unless it's like an extremely dangerous circumstance. So there were all kinds of secret rooms and tunnels that people had in their homes. Sometimes they would put them in wagons with a secret hidden bottom, and I'll show you pictures of some of these. There is a hotel somewhere on the East Coast, and I don't remember what state it's in, and I have not been able to find it since. But I wanted to put it on my bucket list, and I cannot find what it's called. But there is a hotel. It's a small little hotel where it used to be a house that was a station on the Underground Railroad. And there was a bookcase in every room, and behind that bookcase there's a ladder that goes all the way from the top of the house all the way down to the basement. And this would lead down to a secret room in the basement where the runaway slaves would be able to hide. And that way, if slave catchers were going to search the home and they found the room in the basement, they'd be able to climb up the ladder and go into a different room in the house and be able to hide from them that way. So here we have a painting of a woman who is hiding them in a secret room underneath her barn. Sometimes they would mount bookcases to a door and it would slide open that way. Here's another one where you have the secret bottom. So they would lay the slaves down underneath that and then slide the wooden top over and cover it up with supplies so that it looked like the wagon was full of stuff. And this would usually be a method that they used if the slaves absolutely had to travel during the daytime and there were going to be a lot of people around. This way it just looked like a regular wagon just full of supplies, nothing suspicious to see here. And they would just kind of have to pack them in like sardines. This next one is particularly cool to me. It just looks like a normal shelf, but it can slide over to the side and you can crawl through to another room on the other side. The reason why people working on the Underground Railroad had to use so many precautions like codes and secret rooms and tunnels and things like that is because of the Fugitive Slave Act. Helping slaves escape was already illegal, but the Fugitive Slave Act, which we kind of talked about before already, just made it even more difficult and dangerous for everybody involved. Prior to this law, if you just made it past the Ohio River, then you were safe. Slave catchers legally were not allowed to come up there and come after you. But because of this law, and this was something that the South had been pushing for a long time, because from their point of view, this was stolen property and not people trying to get to freedom. This law declared that all runaway slaves had to be brought back to their masters, and anybody who was caught helping them would be prosecuted. Abolitionists nicknamed it the Bloodhound Law because of the dogs that were used to track down runaway slaves. And you can see here, these are different wanted posters for runaway slaves. They would give the names and descriptions of what the people looked like and who to contact and whose plantation to bring them back to if you caught them. Sometimes the slave catchers wanted them brought back alive, and sometimes they wanted them brought back dead. Usually a sign that a slave catcher would give if they decide to bring a slave back dead to a slave owner is they would cut off one of their ears and bring that back as proof that they had actually found them, instead of hauling around the dead body the whole time. runaways would sometimes have to use all kinds of tricks and stuff to evade capture. There was one female slave who had run off a plantation, and she knew that like every single person was going to be looking for this runaway girl slave. So she just kind of tucked her hair up under a hat and put on guy's clothes, and she just looked like a regular boy. And so all these people who were looking for a female runaway slave would just kind of like just glance at her and not pay her a second mind, because that boy wasn't what they were looking for. There was another time, there was this whole group of runaway slaves, and they had sent one of them back a ways to see if anybody was following them, to kind of scout it out. And he came sprinting back that like 3 different slave catchers were on their way. They were charging this way on horses. We only have a little bit of time before they'll be able to see us. What are we going to do? And so what they decided to do is to pretend that they were having a funeral. And so they kind of went off on the side of the road, like in the trees, and they had one of them lay down like he was dead on the ground. And they were all standing around, like just acting the best that they could, like they were in mourning, just absolutely terrified because these guys were going to be riding right past them. And so these slave catchers came galloping down the road and then just rode right past this group of people because, yeah, it looked like a funeral. And they just kind of stayed there for a little bit. And then when the slave catchers eventually rode back down the road the other way, that's when the guy like got up off the ground. They all took off running once they were out of sight again. I think the most creative way is probably Henry Box Brown, though. Henry Box Brown was a slave who taught himself how to read and write. And he got a hold of a newspaper, that the Liberator, the one run by William Lloyd Garrison, and he saw the address up at the top, which was put there. You know, if you want to write a letter or something to the newspaper, like a letter to the editor, or you want to like reach out and say, hey, I have a story, you might be interested, that kind of thing. And so Henry Box Brown thinks to himself, well, I've got this giant crate here, and I've got the address. I'm just going to mail myself there. So he climbed inside the box and kind of sealed it up, and he just kind of glued the address label to the outside and just figured, like, I've got some food, I got some water, I'm curled up in this crate, here we go. And it worked. Like, he'd set the crate down on the dock before climbing inside. And so when the steamship rolled by and say, oh, there's a package that needs to get delivered, they just kind of picked it up. Now, on the outside of this crate, Henry Box Brown had painted this side up because, you know, he didn't want to have it tipped all over and get in a really uncomfortable position. They put him on the boat upside down, and he was upside down for 3 days. He said, I almost passed out. I felt like I was going to die, and he almost did die. But eventually he felt himself get picked up, finally get put right side up again. And after being carried around for a little bit, he felt himself like go inside a building and then get set down. And then he didn't hear anything else. And he was so terrified that like he had no way of knowing whether or not he had made it to the north yet or not, because he couldn't see outside the box. And eventually he heard some people like start walking to the room and talking. Meanwhile, in the office of the Liberator, William Lloyd Garrison's walking around talking to his employees, and he sees, oh, there's this giant package that's been delivered. And so he's like, oh, did somebody order something? Like, who's this for? And then they just hear this tiny, quiet voice coming from inside the box asking, is this the North? And so they're like, oh my gosh, there's a person in there. And so they cracked open the lid, and that's when Henry Box Brown came tumbling out, and they had him tell them all about his story. It was extremely dangerous for the people who were helping, though, and not just because of the slave catchers, but also police officers, because it was now the law that any runaway slave had to be returned to the South. Police officers would also be working with the slave catchers to try to recapture them, because at the time it was the law and they had to do it. And so posters like this warning people, like, don't talk to the watchman, don't talk to police officers, like, they are not here to help you. You are like, you need to like keep it out and keep going on your own. They've been kidnapping and catching people and sending them back. Just keep an eye out, warn your friends. And this is a poster that was put up in Boston. So what I want to know is that if you were a slave on the Underground Railroad, if you were a slave, would you take the chance and go on the Underground Railroad? Because you have to think about it seriously. It's easy for us to say, like, yeah, absolutely, I would. You need to take into account, like, all the risks that go involved in it. If you were caught, a lot of times you would be sold deeper into the South to a plantation where it would be even more difficult to run away from. Or sometimes you'd be beaten. Other punishments. Sometimes the runaway slaves would be lynched, which means they would be hung from either a tree or a lamppost or a tall building somewhere, and left there as a reminder to the other slaves of what happens when you try to run away. Some other times they would chop off fingers. Usually they would go for the pinky and the ring finger, because with those other 3 fingers you could at least still pick stuff up and do work that way. Sometimes they would also like cut off part of your foot, like part of your heel or a couple of toes, meaning like you could still walk around after that and still kind of limp around, but you'd never be able to physically run again. It'd be physically impossible for you. Anybody who would be caught helping slaves escape would also be punished. We talked about this guy, the sailor who had the SS branded into his hand. Sometimes they would also lynch the people who were helping them run away. Like there was jail time that you could also be considering, because it was considered to be like a federal crime. So it wouldn't just be like normal prison. It'd be a federal prison that you'd be sent to if you were caught helping these guys run away. So besides the jail time and the physical like harm to you, like I want you guys to actually think, like if I had been alive back then, knowing all the problems that this could cause and knowing all the repercussions and punishments I could be facing if I get caught doing these things, would you actually run away? Or if you weren't a slave, if you had been just somebody living in the North, would you take the risk of helping other people run away? One of the people who did both is Harriet Tubman. She first tried to run away at the age of 7 years old. She had found out that her master was going to sell her and decided, well, I'm not going to stick around for that. And she decided to escape to the North. The only reason why she didn't make it all the way is because 1, she was 7 years old, and 2, after a few hours, she realized she was cold, she was hungry, she didn't actually know where she was going, and so she went back. She eventually did find out after she had gotten married to another guy. She was about in her 30s. She found out that her slave owner was going to sell her and like separate her husband and herself from each other. And so she decided like, I'm going to run away. And she went to her husband and said, hey, I'm going to run away. I want you to come with me. Like, let's do this. And he just basically said, no, I'm not going to take that risk. And she just went, okay, then bye. And she just left on her own. And after escaping on her own without the help of the Underground Railroad all the way to safety, she decided like, I did amazing at that. I could probably help a lot of other people get away because turns out I'm really good at this. And so she decided to help the abolitionists end slavery, and she became a conductor on the Underground Railroad. She made over 19 rescue trips in over 10 years, and on those 19 different trips, she rescued over 300 slaves, including her 2 parents. Her nickname on the Underground Railroad tended to be either Moses or Aunt Harriet. After working as a conductor on the Underground Railroad and the Civil War had broken out, she also worked as a nurse, a scout, and eventually a spy for the Union during the Civil War. She used a bunch of different disguises working for the Underground Railroad and as a spy in general. She would sometimes like sneak her way onto plantations and dress up as like a crazy old man or old woman. And that way, when she was traveling through the slave states, like a lot of times white slave catchers and slave owners didn't want to deal with her kind of crazy. And so they would just kind of ignore her and leave her alone. She would kind of walk onto the plantations and she would sing a song called Come Down Moses. And that was kind of her code song saying like, hey, I'm nearby. If you guys like are wanting to run away, I'm going to be waiting out here tonight. Anybody who wants to come out here better meet me out here. And that would be a song that like once one slave heard it, they would start singing it. And the other slaves, when they heard it, they would start singing it. That way the word just kind of got passed around the plantation. Like anybody who was willing to take the risk, Moses is going to be waiting out here in the woods for you tonight. And this is like your one shot before she moves on to the next plantation. She would carry sleeping powder with her to stop babies from crying, because if everybody's hiding from these runaway slave catchers, and the baby started crying, everybody was going to get caught. And so she just had this little bag of powder that she would blow into their faces and knock the baby out for a few minutes, while the slave catchers kind of moved on by. She was constantly changing her route and her method of operation, which was kind of frustrating to everybody who was working with her, because you never knew when she was going to be stopping by. And so, like, she kept changing so that the slave catchers could never figure out, like, which route she was going to be taking next or how she was going to do it. She also always carried a pistol on her, just in case, slave catchers caught up, but also mostly to prevent the people she was traveling with from deciding partway through that they didn't want this and wanted to turn around and go home. Because if they go back, slave catchers or slave owners aren't dumb. If a bunch of slaves disappear, and then all of a sudden one of the runaway slaves shows back up again, they're going to figure out what happened, and then they're going to interrogate that slave and torture them until they tell them, okay, what are the names of all the people who helped you? Who was your conductor? Where are all the different safe houses you stayed with? Who lived there? Where were they heading next? And all those people who are trying to help are going to be compromised and arrested, if not just outright killed by these slave owners. And so if anybody tried to run away, she would just kind of pull that pistol out and point it right at their face and say, so here are your options. I can either kill you right here and now, or we can just keep on going and then we don't have to worry about this anymore. During the Civil War, though, she decided that she could be a lot more than just a conductor or a nurse. She decided that she wanted to help more people because there were still people living on plantations who were keeping slaves there during the war. Slavery won't be completely done away with in the United States until after the war. So she decided to plan a huge operation. She dressed up as a regular old slave and snuck onto the plantation, because slave owners are looking for, like, slaves that are missing. They're not going to care if there's, like, oh, I guess there's one extra. I don't know what's going on. And she would pretend to be working, just be a normal slave, and she would sneak onto the plantation. And she got the slaves to start giving her information about the area, like, where do they sleep? What time do they go to bed? Just like in general, like where do they keep their weapons and their ammunition and stuff like that. And then because all these plantations are usually backed up onto a river. And the river that she was focusing on is the Combahee River. And so what the Confederacy had done during the war to prevent the North from sailing up the river and attacking further into the South, they had filled the river with mines. If you have seen Finding Nemo, those big spiky floating balls that are next to the submarine in the first movie, that they kind of bump into and then they all explode very violently. That's what underwater mines are. They're meant to, like, float just kind of underneath the surface of the water, and then if a boat, like, taps up against them, they'll go off. And so they had filled the river with this, but they're still using the river to conduct business and stuff like that. So all these other mariners on the river knew where the mines were and how to avoid them, as she convinced them to, like, mark on a map for her where all the different mines are. And so now with all this information, she led a 25-mile raid down the Combahee River. She would get to a plantation, everybody would jump off, they'd set fire to stuff. All the slaves who saw that figured out what was going on and started booking it for the water and jumped onto the boats. And by the time the slave owners had come out and were ready to, like, start shooting at whoever was attacking them, it was too late. Harriet and all of the slaves were already gone. She freed over 750 slaves in this one night. This was the first military operation led and planned by an American woman, and all of this being a former slave who never learned how to read or write. The spiritual go down Moses was used as a symbol to let the slaves know that she was ready to make another trip. The South hated this woman. They put out a $40,000 bounty, and that's in back then money, out on her for her capture, just because she was so disruptive to their plantations. And she was just this big symbol of hope for all their slaves that one day they too will be able to run away. She was famous for saying that on her Underground Railroad, she never ran her train off the track and she never lost a passenger, meaning that she never got lost, and if once somebody decided to travel with her, they were going to make it to freedom. She's also known for saying, there was one of the two things I had a right to, liberty or death. If I could not have one, I would sure have the other, for no man should take me alive. I should fight for my liberty as long as my strength lasts. And she lived to be about 93 or 94 years old. And she freed over 1,000 slaves in her lifetime. And what's really amazing about Harriet Tubman is she did all this crazy stuff while suffering from narcolepsy. When she was about 8 years old, there was another slave on the plantation who did something to make the master upset, and he was trying to call the slave owner so he could punish him. And so the slave was like, I'm not going to go over there because you're going to hit me with a whip if I go over there. And so he just kind of took off running across the field. And when he wouldn't come back, the slave owner picked up this giant 5-pound metal weight and hucked it at the slave. It missed that guy, but it did hit 8-year-old Harriet in the head, and it put her in a coma for 3 days. She had this kind of like dent in her skull for the rest of her life, and it gave her narcolepsy, meaning that like at any moment when she was doing all this crazy dangerous stuff, she could just knocked out for a few seconds. And that's just really amazing to me, the fact that she'd be like actively running away from slave catchers or doing this really dangerous military raid, and she could have just passed out at any second. And no, she knew this could happen. And she still chose to do all this stuff anyway, because she always felt like she could be doing more to help other people. She was never just satisfied with what she had already done. She does later go on after the Civil War to like open up like a home for slaves who had been displaced and didn't have a place to stay. And she helped a lot of people get jobs. And she was just an amazing woman who was literally helping people until she died. The women's suffrage movement is also pushing along real strong during this time period. Women started to get more involved in the fight against slavery because they believed like if we can help end slavery, then the next logical step is to give women the right to vote. And that's what suffrage means. We talked about the Seneca Falls Convention before with Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony and Lucretia Mott. Almost 300 people, including 40 men, went to this meeting. They were abolitionists and Quakers, housewives, all kinds of people came. And they wrote the Declaration of Sentiment. It was a proposal for women's rights, and they kind of modeled it after the Declaration of Independence. The language is very similar, and it listed the acts of tyranny that they felt that men had over women. And the reason why is because women at this time could not hold office. It was only white men who could do that. They could not practice professions. So going to school, like anything that you pretty much had to go to school to become, like a doctor or a lawyer, you would not be able to do. You could not control your own money or property. It was your husband or your father or whoever your pretty much closest male relative was who would be in charge of your own property and money. And you would also be disciplined by males. So if you were under arrest and you went to prison, it would not be any female officers there. It would all be men. The Seneca Falls Convention was really important because it was the first time like such a significantly large group of women had really organized together for this purpose. And it just kind of spread awareness about women's suffrage. Elizabeth Cady Stanton organized the convention. She was really focused on voting rights. Susan B. Anthony helped turn it into a national organization. And she was worried about helping women get equal treatment in the workplace. Another woman who was there is a woman by the name of Sojourner Truth. Her original name was Isabella Baumfree, but once she got her freedom and started traveling and just telling people about the evils of slavery, she changed her name to Sojourner Truth. Because a sojourner is somebody who travels, and she liked to say that she was traveling around preaching truth. She helped a lot of freed slaves find jobs and homes after they got their freedom, because it was really hard, even after getting your freedom, to find somebody who was willing to hire a runaway slave. Sojourner Truth was a suffragist, and she became a very well-known public speaker for women's rights. She believed that women were the equals of men and deserved equal rights. And this is a famous quote from her: "If women want any rights more than they's got, why don't they just take them and not be talking about it?" Like, she was sick and tired of hearing people just talk about giving women rights, and she's like, if you're wanting to do it, then just do it. Because what are they going to do about it? She gave a very famous speech called Ain't I a Woman? She wanted to bring awareness of like, yeah, we're talking about like women's rights, but also let's take a moment to appreciate the African American women in the room, and how like they're still not being treated the same way that white women were being treated at the time. And she just kind of like got up in the middle of this meeting. So what had happened is a lot of women had gotten up and spoken about like ways that they felt like they didn't have as many rights as men. And then this guy dressed in black, he was a reverend, kind of stood up, and he said a lot of things about how women have so many more rights than men right now. Like we have to help them into carriages and across mud puddles, and just like women don't deserve as many rights as men because, you know, they're not as smart. They don't have as much of what he called an intellect. And he said that, you know, Christ wasn't a woman, so, you know, women shouldn't have as many rights. And as soon as he sat down, Sojourner Truth stood up, and she was like a 6-foot-tall woman, so very intimidating for a lot of the people who were there. And she just kind of walked up to the podium, and she just kind of like started freestyling this speech. Like she didn't write it down ahead of time. Like this was all improvised and on the spot. And so there aren't any like official records of like what was actually said. It's just all kind of written secondhand by people who either started going, oh my gosh, this speech is amazing, just started like writing down really fast trying to keep up with what she was saying, or who wrote it down after the fact. And so it's not exactly word for word what she said, but it's the closest that we've got. And so the one version of the speech that most people agree is probably the closest is one by a guy named Francis Gage. I'm going to put a link to the audio clip that I have. It's not of Sojourner Truth herself giving this speech, but it is of an actress who was recreating this speech. And so I'll put the audio link for that because she's going to do it so much better than I ever could. After you finish here, make sure you finish the Underground Railroad narrative, where you're going to use all the stuff that you've learned about it to create a story about if you had been a slave on the Underground Railroad, how would you have escaped? So make sure you finish that, and as well as any other assignments that you have not finished already. And I will see you guys next time.